Hey guys, one more video about the telepathy tapes. This time we're going to be looking at some of the unintended consequences that come from believing in that particular view. All right, so last time we talked about how if you listen to the podcast, you might not catch this, but if you look at the behind the scenes footage, it becomes incredibly apparent that every single example that they give is actually an example of something called facilitated communication. Facilitated communication is a broken methodology that was disproved in the 90s. And it ultimately shows that a facilitator can accidentally bias results and input their own authorship of ideas when they're intending to help. So below I'll include a video from Janyce Boynton. She's a super interesting character that kind of demonstrates how this might work, right? A facilitator holds a stencil board for the autistic person in order to help them attempt to communicate. And yet when they do that, they're moving around the board and accidentally introducing bias and perhaps introducing their own ideas into the situation. And what I showed in the last video is that we have some really good, clever research done that shows that facilitator influence and facilitator authorship is way more common than you would have expected. Now, in the past video, I argued that this was largely due to something I called the idiomotor effect. Actually, I called it the Ouija board effect, because that's the process that Ouija boards use, where you can feel like the letters are being moved around on their own, but it's actually you using this particular effect. It also is the reason that dowsing rods appear to work. It seems like they're working on their own, but it's actually you who's ultimately controlling it, but perhaps your subconscious is controlling it. So the important takeaway here is this is not an intentional, manipulative, or deceptive practice. This is a completely subconscious practice, where if you anticipate a certain outcome, you're able to engage in subconscious, small, subtle movements that you may not even actually be consciously aware of. So for example, if you're holding a stencil for an individual and you know that 2 + 2 is 4, as the facilitator, you know the correct answer, even if the autistic student reaches their hand out randomly towards the 3, it is very likely that you subconsciously nudge them towards the 4 and end up getting the correct answer. So fortunately, there's really easy ways to dodge this particular phenomenon by not letting the facilitator know the answer, for example. But those precautions are never taken within the show. All right, and that being said, there's another effect that I downplayed and didn't really focus on that is hugely important that makes the idiomotor effect much more prominent. So you can actually generate a lot more false positives with facilitated communication. Do this next thing. Now, Kai Dickens, the podcast host, is going to accidentally explain why this is problematic. So let's listen to her real quick.
And sometimes their hand gets lost in space, so it's good to pull the board away and put it back in again. Or sometimes you have to cue them, go for it. Okay, get that letter, because that will help with their motor planning, right? So those supports are critical. But people will look at those supports and say, oh, well, that must mean they're not typing independently.
They're definitely not typing independently because it's by definition facilitated communication. You're facilitating and helping them communicate. Now, the reasons that she offers for this seem to make sense at first, right? She's saying it's difficult for them to do this task. They don't have good control over their bodily function. It takes so long and it takes so much effort. You can just speed up the process by helping nudge them towards the right answer. And she allows you to cue them. So she allows you to encourage them to get the answer that you know is right. And when their hand glances over the correct answer, you pull the board away, locking in the correct answer. It just speeds things up. You're essentially acting like auto aim or aim assist in a video game, or the steering assist in Mario Kart, something along those lines. The issue is that methodology itself, the practice of helping them get the right answer and kind of speaking for them a little bit, encouraging them to the right answer, that leads to tremendous amounts of facilitator authorship that's entirely accidental. So you think you're helping, but you end up accidentally authoring rather than co-authoring, or rather than just merely assisting. Let me show a completely unambiguous example of facilitator authorship.
What's 6 times 2? Good. Okay, space. What's 12 times 12 plus 1? We carried the 1, remember? What's 12 plus 1? Excellent, give me 5.
All right, now keep in mind the facilitator is not doing any of this on purpose. It's all entirely subconscious. And since the subconscious is running the show, if you can dream it, it can make its way into the conversation. So the telepathy tapes end up having to defend all kinds of crazy ideas, not just that autistic people can read minds, but that they can talk to plants, they can talk to animals, they can talk to dead people, and they can speak languages they've never come across before, and that they are able to spell perfectly despite having never been taught, and that they have a guardian, or Cleopatra's their guardian angel, and that there's one god, and that there's multiple gods, and that magic rocks exist, and that they can psychically communicate with each other over long distances, and just anything that subconsciously crosses the facilitator's mind is going to be fair game, because ultimately facilitated conversation or facilitated communication is accidentally a conversation with your own subconscious that you are misattributing to the autistic individual that you are facilitating for.
Telepathy is just the tip of the iceberg. And in time, Amelia revealed that she knows other things, like she can understand multiple languages.
She wrote in Portuguese. She often writes in Spanish. She, in one sentence, went from Spanish to English to Portuguese.
All right, a better explanation is that because you are able, or your subconscious is able to write in perfect English, that she's now able to spell despite having never been taught. And because you're subconsciously aware of English and Spanish and Portuguese, that the person you're facilitating for is all of a sudden also able to write in those languages.
And how does she say she knows that?
She'll either say God taught her or the gods, plural. And she says that he teaches her at night. Sometimes she will say she was born knowing that. And one time I did ask her, I said, so you knew it as a baby? And she said before. So whatever she was referring to.
All right, so dreams don't have to be consistent, and neither do these conversations. It can be one God, multiple gods. It can be you were taught this before you were born, you knew this when you were born, or you were taught it after. None of it has to actually make sense. It just has to be coming from the facilitator's subconscious. Now, what would happen if I took, let's say, a guy named Joe from Highlands Church, which is a non-denominational, charismatic-leaning church, and I had them be the facilitators? What kind of ideas might we come up with then?
Two that I've seen prominent in our spellers, I would say, would be prophecy and a word of knowledge.
All right, what a coincidence. What would happen if I had a person that believed in reincarnation as the facilitator? What ideas might come up then? I think you guys get the gist here. Now, one facilitator gets really close to stumbling onto the truth.
I thought, am I holding these memories in my subconscious and they're picking it up?
Okay, so almost, but not quite. You are holding the memories in your subconscious, but the autistic person is not picking it up. Rather, facilitated communication leads to a type of error where your subconscious is the one you're actually having a conversation with, right? You, as the facilitator, are the actual author, which is why it seems like the person you're speaking with is able to understand what's going on in your subconscious. Now, you can also prime individuals very easily. So if I suggest to you that I have a magic rock, for example, that might influence the way you're subconscious, or you might be subconsciously thinking about the rock and trying to explain it. And then when you talk, or you facilitate for the autistic individual, then that's where it might manifest.
Houston's bedroom has rocks and stones and crystals everywhere. Wow, Houston, this is incredible. I asked Katie how his passion for collecting stones started.
A friend of mine gave me 3 stones, and when she gave them to me, she said she had prayed over them. So this was very strange to me. I'm an evangelical Christian, and this was just not part of my practice in my faith. So I really didn't know what to make of this.
All right, if you don't know what to make of it, you're subconsciously worried about it or thinking about it, that's the kind of thing that'll manifest, and now you have a room full of rocks that you think are magical. Now, this can get more insidious. This is where Pandora's box begins to get opened. Since the subconscious is the one that's running the show here, if I prime you to think about, hey, most autistic people are sexually assaulted, right? Even if that's not true, even if I just put that idea in your mind, you can see where your mind might run with it. If you can see that you believe you're able to telepathically communicate with your son, like you're the mother and you believe you can telepathically communicate with your son, but it never works when you try it on your father, what excuses might your subconscious come up with to explain away that discrepancy? And here's where it gets dangerous. So we'll let those same individuals, Katie and Houston, continue telling their story.
My ex-husband was an incredibly violent, abusive, and intentionally cruel man. Houston had to hear his schemes and his plans. The abuse wasn't limited to just me.
Katie's ex committed horrible crimes against another member of the family. Katie didn't know about the horrific acts as they were occurring. Only Houston did, because he could hear everyone's thoughts. And it wasn't until Houston learned to communicate via spelling that Katie finally found out what had happened.
All right, an important takeaway here is if you are ever using facilitated communication, you cannot trust the results that you get. That method leads to your subconscious being the accidental author of these conversations. Of those 180 experiments we looked at last time, all of them ended up being evidence that it was accidental facilitator authorship going on. So you can't trust that method. And for some reason, it becomes really common and really easy to end up accusing people of sexual assault using facilitated communication. Whether it's priming or expectations or whatever it might be, it's just a common phenomenon. Just like it's common that the facilitator believes that the autistic individual is a poet. Right? These are just trends that end up happening over and over again. And this type of unforeseen consequence can be seen here. An article called Psychological Treatments That Cause Harm. It details that in the 90s, back when this was really popular and there were facilitators in classrooms all across America, were spending millions of dollars having facilitators trying to help, it ended up happening that the facilitators would regularly accuse family members of engaging in sexual assault. They thought that the autistic individuals were confessing this, when in fact it is the subconscious facilitators' beliefs that end up bleeding through. Over 60 times this accusation was made. This tore apart families, right? This is making the kids go into foster care who are nonverbal autistic. Like, it's probably not a healthy environment to be in foster care in that type of situation. And this drugged the families through the courts, ruined reputations. It just has profoundly negative results. There was actually one really famous case. Janyce Boynton was the facilitator and had accused the brother and the father of engaging in sexual assault. And later, she came to realize the facilitated communication had some serious problems. And now she actually, kind of in a redemption arc, tries to make academic videos showing the problems with facilitated communication. I'll actually link to her channel down below. She's got some really good information. But this leads to all kinds of problems. One of them you can see in this bioethics article. And the issue came across here is a rather famous one that happened more recently. But ultimately, the facilitator, because it's a conversation with their own subconscious, ends up hallucinating a conversation in which consent is given from the autistic person to her, and they start engaging in a sexual relationship. So this can lead easily to false accusations of sexual abuse, and it can actually lead to the perpetuation of sexual abuse as well. Now, some folks will end up asking a question like this. Well, maybe sometimes it works, right? All the evidence we looked at before said it was always facilitator communication, but maybe sometimes it works. Maybe it can be like training wheels for independent communication. And I'll actually let someone a bit more qualified than me. We're going to look at a quick clip from Ryan Sutera, a speech pathologist who works for Support the Spectrum. I'll let her field this question.
And there's a such thing as facilitator bias, meaning that the person helping might subconsciously or consciously be dictating what that person communicates. They may have the best of intentions, but it doesn't really matter. On that same note, it doesn't really promote independence, and that AAC user might become dependent on someone helping them and assisting them with using their AAC systems. It's giving facilitated communication, which is a pseudoscience technique that's been wildly discredited in the speech therapy community. And the last point I'm going to make, which is probably the most convincing, is that there is no research, no evidence to show that rapid prompting method leads to independent communication.
All right. One last little tidbit. Spelling to communicate and the rapid prompting method are both just repackaged newer versions of the classic facilitated communication. As always, test everything. Hold on to the good.